The name Natalie is derived from the Latin phrase Natalie Domini, meaning birth of the Lord. In many ways, it is a popular name for sure, but on Survivor, it is the name of royalty. Throughout Survivor, we have had 5 Natalies play the game of Survivor, and almost all of them have made deep runs on the show while making a marked legacy on the gameplay, where of 5 Natalies, we have 2 winners, 4 finalists, and 5 Final Four appearances. And when you mix in the impact that they've had on Survivor history and the legacies that they leave behind, Natalie has left one of the strongest imprints on the show's history. But it's also a name that has been in decline in recent years, where despite tons of early success, in many ways things have sort of been on the downside in recent years. In this video, I want to explore that story, talk about the Natalies, and share their journeys through this amazing game. Welcome to the history of Natalies. Our story begins in 2007. Despite the lack of Natalies, Survivor had been pretty successful up to this point, lasting for over 15 seasons, and it was now time for another returnee season. Although, due to their inability to get certain returnees, they had to settle for a half and half season with 10 returnees and 10 fans of the show. And it was at this point that we saw our first Natalie enter the picture. Natalie Bolton was one of the 10 lucky fans that would have the chance to play this wonderful game alongside a lot of her fan favorites. Placed on the fans I-Ride tribe, things were pretty ho-hum early on. She found herself in the majority, and while much of the drama centered around Joel and taking his shots against Mikey B, not much was really going on for Natalie early on. She just followed through those votes, taking out Mary and Mikey in swift fashion. But then a tribe swap hit, and she was now given the opportunity to play alongside 4 favorites. James Clement, who was on the most recent season, was on her tribe, alongside Jonathan Penner and Parvati Shallow from Cook Islands, and Eliza Orleans from Survivor Vanuatu. And while this tribe would suffer 2 casualties in Jonathan Penner being medevaced and Kathy Sleckman quitting the game, Natalie avoided tribal during this section, while building a very close bond with both Parvati and Alexis that would prove pretty vital at the merge. Sure enough, the merge came. And while the first round was pretty boring after Eliza tried to pass off a stick as a hidden immunity idol, something deeper was brewing beneath the surface. You see, Parvati, Suri, and Amanda had largely controlled the game in the pre-merge on the favorites side, and while they had James and Ozzy in their back pocket, they were looking to take a different path. And sure enough, they recruited the 2 other women in the game, that being Alexis and, sure enough, Natalie, to flip the game against the people not in this new alliance. Natalie agreed, and the game plan was set. By this point in the season, Ozzy's ego had grown to the size of about 7 suns. On his original season, he won 5 of the 6 individual immunity challenges. He won the fan favorite award from that season, and at this point in the season, he seemed to be in a good spot. After all, he had a bit of a flirtmance going on with Amanda. He had just tricked Jason and Eliza into thinking that a stick he planted was an actual hidden immunity idol, not to mention the fact that he himself had the real idol. And with his proven challenge ability, there was little doubt in his mind that he could ride his way to the end and get the win that he came so close to getting on Cook Islands. Ozzy was simply unstoppable. Or so he thought. It was decided that something needed to be done against his god among men before he had the chance to steamroll the competition. And once Parvati won the next immunity challenge, the plan was set. Well, with one complication. Amanda did still have some allegiance to Ozzy at this point, and she didn't exactly go through with the plan. However, with Jason as the backup target in case an idol was played, the Black Widow Brigade didn't really need to worry about much. And sure enough, Ozzy did not play his idol, and he was blindsided 5-4. Even without Amanda's vote, the game had officially flipped, and all of a sudden, things were looking up for Natalie Bolton. The next round, Jason managed to find the replanted idol that Ozzy had left behind, making him a bit of a threat. However, with them getting Eric on their side after he won immunity, they were able to split the vote between Jason and James, ensuring that they got their way. And James threw his vote onto Parvati, while Jason threw his vote onto James, ensuring that Natalie would be safe. And sure enough, Jason was blindsided 4-3-1, also with an idol in his pocket. and with James being medevac the next round due to a finger infection, it seemed that the Black Widow Brigade was destined to steamroll the rest of the season. However, it was at this point that complications started to arise. You see, despite Natalie being a later addition to this group, she didn't exactly have the numbers within that, as the group was comprised of 3 returnees versus only 2 newbies. Not good. And plus, when Eric won the next immunity at the final 6, it basically forced the Black Widow Brigade to turn on each other. However, fortunately for Natalie, it seemed that Amanda was going to be the target over them, and they even managed to convince Eric to go along with this plan. But then at Tribal, Amanda whipped out an immunity idol that nobody knew about, resulting in Alexis being blindsided instead. And while you could call this a pro for Natalie, in the sense that they chose Natalie over Alexis, it basically made it so that this numbers advantage was even worse, to where now she was the only returnee among a group that was mostly returnees. Meaning that more than likely, once it got down to just the Black Widow Brigade, that Natalie would be at the bottom. Not good. And this seemed to be her fate at the final 5 when Eric managed to win immunity again, thus ensuring that the Black Widow Brigade would have to turn on each other. And Natalie's fate was pretty much sealed. But before her torch could be snuffed, the women had one last idea up their sleeve. It was crazy, but it was worth throwing out there. What if Eric, the guy who had been at the bottom at this point and would have been the clear target had he not won immunity, gave up the immunity necklace at Tribal? I know it sounds crazy, but this wasn't the first time someone had done so. After all, we saw Jenna Maraska give up her immunity necklace in Survivor Amazon, and yet she somehow managed to not only survive the round, but go on to win the season. So what if they made Eric, a massive superfan of the show, think that he could follow the same fate? All he had to do was think that he would be doing Amanda a favor by giving up this necklace. After all, he did kind of burn her by not sending her on some rewards, so clearly this was a perfect exchange to make up for that. So the women got to work, spending the afternoon trying to convince Eric to give it up. And for a while, it seemed pretty unlikely to work. I mean, despite what I said a moment ago about Jenna, Eric couldn't be that stupid, right? Well, Tribal came, and when Jeff came to ask Eric what he wanted to do, he announced, not only to all the women, not only to the jury, but to the entire viewing world, that he was giving up his immunity necklace and handing it to Natalie. The plan had worked. As crazy as it seemed, Natalie was saved for one more round, and Eric was voted out unanimously at this next Tribal. But despite being safe for one more day, the same fundamental problem persisted, where Natalie was the only newbie in a group that was predominantly returnee. And considering that the 3 returnees, Amanda, Suri, and Parvati, had a final 3 at this point, it basically meant that Natalie was forced to win Final 4 immunity to have a shot of getting to the end. And when she failed to do so, she was voted out 3-1. While I wouldn't say Natalie was in the driver's seat of what the Black Widow Brigade was doing, the fact that she was included in this group is pretty impressive and was a good first showing for the Natalies. For her to get all the way to the Final 4, being the last fan remaining on a season of fans versus favorites, says something about Natalie's potential. And to this day, people continue to bring up Natalie Bolton as a possible returnee option. And the fact that she hasn't gone back yet is a shame, if you ask me. But in the end, she simply ran out of runway, where she was the last newbie in a season of returnees, something that eventually came back to bite her. But even so, even though she came up short at the end, Natalie set an example for what Natalies could accomplish on Survivor. Our next Natalie came just 3 seasons later on Survivor Samoa, where we have Natalie White. On the surface, Natalie didn't seem like much. She seemed like your pretty typical female casting choice at the time, a young, pretty face from Arkansas, but this Natalie had quite a bit in her, more than what many people expected at the time. Natalie was placed on the Fo'ofo'a tribe, and early on she was approached by another southerner by the name of Russell Hance to be part of his Dumbass Girl Alliance.
I like to call it my Dumbass Girl Alliance.
Despite the name, Natalie agreed to join the alliance alongside the other Fo'ofo'a woman, and through that, they were able to get through a lot of those early votes, taking on Marissa, Betsy, Ben Browning, Ashley, and Liz. On the surface, you might be wondering what made Natalie so special that she ended up surviving all these votes. After all, she was just another young, pretty face, just like a lot of the other Fo'ofo'a women. However, it turns out that Russell particularly pointed out Natalie as his easiest beat, and sure enough, that compelled him to drag her through the game. But in turn, Natalie herself felt pretty similarly about Russell. She gets this interesting confessional about how he's going to take all the bullets, and that if she got to the end with him, that she would come out on top. And through this agreed partnership, whether or not they knew that they saw each other as their easiest beat, they got through the game together, taking out all their other bigger threats until they were the final four. It was Natalie and Russell, plus Mick, who despite being named the tribe leader, was pretty feckless and wasn't really well respected in the game, and Jason, who had lost his socks after Russell burned them on the first night. But at last, they finally did it. They got to the end together. No one else stood in their way. Well, except the other tribe, and it was only the merge. While they did lose their leader in Russell Swan along the way, the Lu dominated Foa in the pre-merge challenges, allowing them to come into the merge at an 8-4 numbers advantage, putting Natalie and her fellow tribe mates in a pretty dire situation. After all, we had seen multiple times on seasons without tribe swaps that the tribe that comes into the merge with the numbers more often than not steamrolls their way to the end. And with that track record, Natalie was pretty destined to get screwed over here. However, not all was lost. You see, one downside to not going to tribal much in the pre-merge is that there was a lot of tension and division within the old Galoos, particularly between the men and the women. And through Natalie being able to build some bonds with the other Galoo members, they were able to flip the vote against Eric Cardona, the perceived leader of the men's contingent, in a 10-2 vote. Alright, now you're just down 4-7. However, Russell also wasted his idol at this tribal, which was a key asset to the Foes potentially shaking up the game in the future, and certainly the Galoos weren't going to make the same mistake twice in voting out one of their own. At the time, it just felt like a temporary stay on their execution before the Galoos finally got their act together, settled their differences, and got the business. And got the business they did when they decided to throw their votes onto Russell at the next tribal, who was seen as the leader of the Foa group. But in a shocking turn of events, Russell found another idol the very next round that he was able to successfully play on himself, negating all 7 of the Galoos' votes and giving the Foas their pick of the slaughter, which they ended up picking Kelly for, who was seen as a key piece of the women's contingent. Suddenly, it felt like the Foa, who had come into the merge in an impossible situation, were starting to turn things around as they were only down by 2 at this point. However, it was also in this round that the Galoos started to see Natalie as a bigger threat due to her being under the radar and less likely to have an idol played on than Russell, and it's not like they can just rely on Russell continually finding idols, especially in the chance that one of the Galoos managed to find it. So it was a pretty unfortunate situation for Natalie in particular. Now fortunately, they didn't exactly need an idol. You see, the Galoos, despite being unified on the previous vote, still had some tension looming. Enter Shannon, or Shambo as she likes to be called, a former Marine that was on the Galoo tribe, however was never well situated on that group. She was seen as a bit of an outsider due to her being continually sent to the Foa tribe during the pre-merge as an advisor, which just happened to be the twist for that season. But it was through that twist that the Foas were able to build a connection with Shambo and making her feel a bit more welcome on their side than on the Galoo side. And while it didn't translate to her voting with them at the merge per se, we were now at a point where it only took one Galoo member flipping in order to force a tie over what would otherwise be a straightforward 6-4 Natalie boot. And when Russell approached her with such a proposition, Shambo agreed. Suddenly things were looking up for Natalie, and sure enough, we got a 5-5 tie at tribal between Natalie and Laura, who at that point was seen as the biggest threat on Galoo after winning the last 2 immunities in a row. But what good is a tie if you have no way of breaking it, particularly in your favor? Enter John Fincher, another Galoo member, who was getting increasingly frustrated with Laura and in general the Women's Alliance that left him out of the core power structure of the Galoos at that point. Russell approached him about flipping as well. However, John wasn't quite willing to outright vote out Laura initially, but when asked whether he would be fine voting out Laura on a re-vote, assuming someone else were to flip, John was a bit more on board with that. And fast forward to Tribal, where we got that tie and the prospect of going to a rock draw, John figured that it was probably not great to leave his game up to chance and flipped on the revote, sending out Laura in a 5-3 vote. While it wasn't great that Natalie didn't have more of a hand in saving herself during this point where she was in danger, her alliance still came out on top, and in the process outcasted both John and Shambo for being flippers against their original tribe. And after John was voted out near unanimously at the next tribal, the Fo'ofoas suddenly were in the driver's seat thanks to Shambo being on board, and after Dave was voted out the next tribal, they had the outright majority coming to the final 7, which they used to take out Monica at 7. But then things got a bit more complicated. Enter Brett, who was nearly invisible for most of the season, sort of similar to Natalie. In fact, some reports claimed that Brett wasn't even a real person, that he was simply a CGI rendering added in order to fill out the cast. But with the season coming down to the wire, Brett suddenly emerged as the biggest obstacle to the Fo'ofoas getting to the end and securing the win. At Final 6, Brett won immunity, forcing the Fo'ofoas to cut Shambo. At Final 5, Brett won immunity again, which this time forced the Fo'ofoas to suddenly turn on each other for the first time since the merge, and with Jason being the clear outsider, he was cut in 5th. And with there being just one round left, things were suddenly looking dire. If Brett won this last challenge and got to the end, he'd be almost guaranteed to win, given that the jury was almost entirely Galoom members. The Fo'ofoas had to pull out a win, and with it being an endurance comp, Russell ultimately came on top, securing that final immunity. And while Russell did toy with the idea of forcing a tie to give Brett a chance at fire, this was ultimately a false ploy, as the Fo'ofoas were more than happy to vote out Brett 3-1. And just like that, 3 Fo'ofoas had gotten to the end, including Natalie. And considering she was only the second Natalie to play Survivor, after the first had gone all the way to the final 4, this was nothing short of impressive. But what good is just getting to the end if you can't win as well? And as it turned out, a lot of the jury was actually pretty in favor of voting for Natalie, despite her not being in the driver's seat of the Fo'ofoa Alliance. Mick was largely dismissed as being feckless, as I mentioned earlier. However, a lot of the jury was also pretty upset by Russell and the way he handled them on the way out. Admittedly, I think this gets a bit overblown. However, he still treated certain people poorly, particularly Monica at that final 7 round. And with Russell coming off as pretty cocky and unlikable despite running the game, this gave Natalie a clear opening to win over the jury. And this was best encapsulated by Eric Cardona, the very first victim of the Fo'ofoa's comeback at the merge, who says that perception is not reality, reality is reality. And she is sitting there, which makes her just as dangerous as any of those guys sitting there. And while she would say that she's probably the least deserving of the title of Sole Survivor, maybe, just maybe, in an environment filled with arrogance, delusional entitlement, maybe the person who thinks that she's least deserving is probably the most. And in the end, Natalie was the most deserving, winning in a 7-2 jury vote against Russell, only losing out on Fincher and Shambo's votes. Already, Natalie was proving to be one of the most successful names for any potential Survivor player, going 2 for 2 in making the final 4 and 1 win all in the span of just 4 seasons. It was truly remarkable to say the least. Admittedly, a lot of people were not happy by Natalie's win, as she feels like Russell deserved it more. Least of which was Russell himself, who tried to buy the title Sole Survivor during the reunion for $100,000, which Natalie refused. And even Jeff has gone on record as saying that Natalie's one of the worst winners in all Survivor. And while this dissatisfaction has toned down over time to where people are starting to recognize the value of jury management and where Russell went wrong, Natalie still isn't seen as that great of a winner, mainly due to her hiding behind Russell for so much of the game. And while I wouldn't personally have Natalie that high on a winner ranking, I will admit that Natalie took a gamble and succeeded. She recognized that Russell's someone that would help her get to the end of the game, but also burn enough bridges along the way to ensure that she could benefit from all that anger. Is it the most reliable strategy in the world? No, but you also have to give Natalie credit for recognizing that Russell could be that type of player. And you also have to give her some credit for building relationships with the Galoos that allowed her to build some inroads, that allowed them to flip on Eric early on the merge, and allowed them to keep the Fo'ofoas in the game for longer than they probably should have, until it was too late. So to that end, I think Natalie deserves some merit. She may not be the best winner in the world, but at the end of the day, she won Survivor, and that's more than almost every Survivor player can say. So all in all, Natalie White is pretty impressive. It would only be 3 more seasons before we got another Natalie, this time on Survivor Redemption Island, a season that also had Russell Hantz on it, but here we have Natalie Tenorelli. However, this time Natalie would not be on the same tribe as Russell, but rather she was placed on the Ometepe tribe with Russell's biggest rival, Boston Rob. Early on, Natalie seemed to be like most of the rest of her tribe. She was placed on the majority alliance, and she voted with them. However, Rob took a particular liking to Natalie. He saw her as the perfect partner, but it's also going to be hard. It's literally going to be like picking the girl up, putting her on his back, and he's going to drag her ass to the end, and hopefully they're going to give it to Rob at the end. In some ways, this is similar to how Natalie White was seen by Russell on Samoa, where he saw her as the easy beat, and therefore the comparisons began to start. Sure enough, Rob picked up Natalie as his number 1, and with Philip joining their alliance after the map boot, they were essentially able to ride their way to the merge, where despite them losing some of those early immunity challenges and being at a deficit, these Abateras end up going on a pretty epic losing streak after deciding to throw the immunity challenge, where from that point on, the Ometepes were able to get to the merge with a 6-5 numbers advantage. Now, Matt did come back into the game through Redemption Island, which made things a bit complicated. You'd think that considering that Matt, a former Ometepe member that was voted out by Rob himself and Nat, that he would potentially flip to the Zapateras, which would have forced a 6-6 tie. But in an interesting twist, Matt decided to remain true to the Ometepes, which would have given them a 7-5 numbers advantage. However, Rob decided that Matt was simply too unreliable and cut him at the first tribal, and in the process flushing the Zapateras idol, and along with that any hope and any doubt that Natalie had in getting deeper into the game. Just like that, the Ometepes had the numbers advantage, and they wasted no time in cutting the Zapateras one by one until it was down to just the Ometepes. Admittedly, Natalie didn't do much during this stretch of the game. Rob was pretty much in the driver's seat the entire time, while she simply voted with him. And while she did win that first immunity challenge after the merge, aside from that, Natalie was mostly a background character, and there were certainly more comparisons to be made with Natalie Tenorelli and Natalie White. There was a chance that Natalie could get to the end against Rob and feed off the bitterness of these Apateras in order to potentially win a jury vote. However, Natalie never quite gets that confessional that Natalie White did, where she talks about recognizing that Russell, or I guess Rob in this case, would be taking all these bullets. It really felt like we were getting solely Rob's perspective on all this, and there was a lot of confidence, at least within the edit, that Rob's strategy was ultimately going to work here. But once it was down to just the Ometepes, it was pretty clear that Rob's final 3 was himself, Natalie, and Philip, in that the outsiders in Grant, Ashley, and later Andrea were on the outs and were going to be taken out. Andrea was the first victim, followed by Grant, which was actually the only tribal this season where Natalie got any votes against her. However, it was pretty futile as Grant was easily voted out there. After that, Andrea won her way back into the game through Redemption Island, but was immediately voted out thereafter. And then it was down to the final 4, where it was Rob, Natalie, Philip, and Ashley. And while Ashley tried to talk some sense into Natalie to get her to flip against Rob, Natalie ultimately decided to remain true to her number 1. And when Rob won final immunity, Ashley was cut. And just like that, Natalie found herself at the end once again. All in all, it was a truly impressive track record for another Natalie to get towards the end of the game. And in many ways, there were similarities between Natalie Tenorelli and Natalie White. Both of them played behind pretty dominant players for a lot of it, particularly dominant players that were more than willing to burn the opposition on their way to begonging them. And with there being a pretty clear precedent towards this style of player winning out over the more impressive, albeit flawed player, there was certainly optimism that Natalie could come in there and ride her way to a win. Unfortunately, that optimism died pretty fast. While a lot of the Zapateras on the jury were pretty mad at Rob for the way he treated them on their way out, that's not to say they were in Natalie's corner either. They saw Natalie for what she was, a loyal follower to Rob, even at the point where Ashley tried to get Natalie to flip against Rob, she just didn't go along with it. They saw Natalie as simply Rob's follower, not really doing much in the game, and not someone that they really wanted to reward at the end. And while Natalie White had a very clear supporter on the jury in Eric, who was more than willing to articulate why Natalie deserved to win, this Natalie had David Murphy, who spent his speech praising Rob and why Rob manipulated everyone, played the perfect game, the greatest game, in fact, in all Survivor, while completely dunking on both Natalie and Philip. And in the end, Rob ended up crushing Natalie in an 8-1-0 vote. And that one other jury vote went to Philip of all people. So yeah, this Natalie didn't quite get the same results as Natalie White. Now that's not to say Natalie's the worst player in the world. The fact that Rob saw her as someone he wanted to take deep into the game is somewhat impressive, and while she didn't really do much to garner that loyalty, she is still someone that was in the majority for the entire game. And heck, had there been a final two between Natalie and Philip, she probably wins that. The only problem is that final two was never happening on this season, especially with the precedent of there being a final three. And compared to everyone else, it's hard to see how Natalie wins against even the other Omotepes, where I feel like Ashley would have beaten Natalie, for instance. I feel like Grant would have beaten Natalie. There is a bit of a debate over Andrea, considering she came back into the game from Redemption. However, even then, I'm inclined to think Andrea beats Natalie as well. Really, the cards were stacked against Natalie, and in some ways you could say that Natalie Tenorelli was a victim of the success of Natalie White, where we had seen both on Samoa and Heroes vs. Villains that the more dominant player, i.e. Russell Hantz, was punished by the jury in favor of voting for a more under-the-radar style of winner. And so on Redemption Island, yes, while the Zapateros were not happy with Rob, they saw those recent seasons and want to set an example that not all juries can be bitter, that they can respect good gameplay, and with them rewarding Rob, that largely came at Natalie's expense. Now, in recent years, Natalie has come around a bit more. In fact, she was even a candidate to be on Second Chance. However, even so, Natalie is remembered as a very successful Natalie in terms of placement, in terms of longevity, and one that fits within this narrative of Natalie's making deep runs in the game, but ultimately, she came up short.